Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Weird Music, the show where we of course dive into weird and unusual albums that, straddle the line between convention and difference, And of course, within the Weird Music series, this is the mini-series we're doing where we're taking a dive into each and every album by the legendary band Swans. So, in that first episode, we took a dive into the debut album Filth, a dirty, screeching, angry no-wave excursion. And today, we follow on into the year 1984 and take a look at the brilliant follow-up album, Cop. So, we already asked ourselves who were Swans in episode 1, so there's no need to do that in each and every episode. But what we can ask ourselves is who were Swans when this album was recorded. An obtuse way of introducing this into the series, but whatever, let's just move on. So for Cop, Swans was comprised of members Michael Gira, of course, on vocals, tapes and production, Norman Westberg back on the guitar still, screeching away with his, dirty sounding guitars. Harry Crosby continuing the bass duties, and Rolly Mosselman on drums and production. So of course, for Cop, we have lost member Jonathan Cain, who seems to have stepped down from the band despite actually being one of the founding members of it, but c'est la vie, it is what it is. And so yeah, with Cop, actually I'll address the elephant in the room right now. My version of Cop has the greed, holy money thing, but it is right there. Cop, Young God, it's a big thing. We'll get into this later, actually. But yeah, when I hold this up, I'm referring to Cop at the moment. Regardless, though, Cop opens up with the really intense half-life, which just screeches, it whines, it obliterates with its really nasty guitar lines while these descending bass notes pummel away alongside those slow, sludgy drums. And this is a brilliant opener. This is like one of my favourite of the early Swans era stuff, It's, it immediately places back that stark and bleak atmosphere of severe uncomfortableness. And, lyrically, Gira howls away, discussing conformity within society, commanding you to work with a purpose and don't make a wrong move. And speaking of, when he howls out the "don't make a wrong move" bit, man, I love how his voice sounds at that bit. It's so satisfying. But yeah, back to lyrically, it's almost like this mysterious figure looking down again upon Gira from high up on the ladder. And this is something we've seen before, especially on Filth. This came up quite a few times, and here we are back at it again on Cop here. It is very interesting, and it's such a brilliant way to open it all up. It's so dirty, it's so slow though. It just trudges along at this really weird pace, but man, I find it so dark and satisfying, So from there, we move on to the second track, Job. This one has another really screechy guitar line from Westberg, which does that very weird ascending thing and it just sounds so nasty and discordant, It creates this really ugly, unsettling atmosphere alongside that pounding rhythm section, whilst once again, Gira's howling out again, this very visceral description of the human body. And for me, I think it's expressing this notion of the human body itself, trying to push through this repetitive nature of physical labor in various jobs. And, we discussed it in the first episode, but with Gira having worked in construction in the early 80s, it's kind of easy to see him resenting, the very notion of physical labor itself, And at least that's what I interpret from it. It's very brutal and very uncomfortable, but it's so quintessentially Swans. So, onto the third track. We get given Why Hide? And this is another one built around very slow pounding rhythmic drums, backed by that really low end bass that pummels and pushes through. Like, it's like walking through this really murky, muddy bog, that you can barely push your feet through. And again, you listen to Westberg's guitar, it's got this really screechy, whining, fuzzy quality that just seems to consistently drone throughout the entire track. And as well, it's got this really unsettling tape loop that pops up in the beginning, further pushing the uncomfortable nature of the track. It's really peculiar how, the music itself, it sounds all so peculiar and lo-fi and stuff, but it's so heavy and nasty and so slow and sludgy. But once again though, Gear is at the forefront of this thing, howling such self-deprecation and misery. And this one's so nasty and visceral with its imagery. It gives off images of someone accepting their place in society despite the anguish and misery that they're feeling consistently day to day. Almost as though one is expected to actually never reveal these dark thoughts that plague the mind of so many, and instead, keep quiet, keep working, You stick to your place in society and you don't get to budge from there. You are stuck where you are. And man, there's something so resentful about, and understandably so resentful about that in how Gira expresses it. I think it's amazing. So then, move on to Clayman. This is another track that's sort of rooted in expressing disdain at expectations in society. It creates this really vivid and visceral story in the process. To be fair, so many tracks on Cop are very visceral. But yeah, with this one, there's this wonderful drum beat that's, pushing this one along, whilst the bass sounds like someone slamming their fingers down on the bottom notes of a piano. So heavy and clunky on this thing. I think I love how that thing sounds. It's such a... Man, it's intimidating, but it's so cool how it sounds. It gives the track itself such an interesting quality to it. And again, back to the howling and growling and stuff. Gira in this one, he's got this really guttural, nasty tone to how he's sounding, and it perfectly matches those really miserable instrumentals we're given. And again, given a sort of story of superiors looking down, upon a broken person who can easily be moulded and forced to work due to their position in society. Very cynical track again, but for the right reasons again. We sort of look at Gira's experiences and in New York during these times. In the last episode, New York was in the throes of decay, as he described. And you were stuck in your position, stuck in where you were in society, and you would become incredibly jaded and cynical, right? Understandably. And this one just really highlights that so brilliantly. So in the last video, I got the A and B side of the vinyl records mixed up a bit, so I'm going to try not to make that mistake again. So on the original release in 1984 on vinyl, Clayman closed the A side, and this gave us the track Your Property to open up the B side as the last stretch of the album. And I like to mention about vinyls though, especially flipping things over, because it, when you have an A side, it starts and finishes, and then B side starts and finishes as well. It's another entry point to the album experience. You've got that gap as you have to literally flip over the record. And so, Your Property opens up side B, and this is, I've got to say, this is another favourite of mine. There's this phenomenal repetitive bass that is just thumping along. It gives the track this amazing energy and presence, as the drums do these amazing fills throughout the whole track though, and behind all that, Westberg's guitar again, it's just screeching, whining in this horrible discordant mess. And truly brilliant, whilst Gira again screams, shouts and howls this uncomfortable existential dirge about succumbing to someone's authority. And man, such a raw, angry and visceral track this one is. It's got this tremendous and heavy weight to it as it just pushes along. As well though, this is an interesting track to note though, because we're going to see elements of this track in some of the later episodes. Your Property props up in some ways and forms on the 1996 release of Soundtracks for the Blind. And this is I mention it because it's actually very interesting how Swans actually do this. They sort of look back in the past, take things from it, and bring it to at the time it was the future or the present, whatever. But it's interesting to see. It's just interesting to see because this is a really early Swans track, and what they turned it into on Soundtracks for the Blind is very interesting. I would say, it's very peculiar. But on Cop though, man, this is so just heavy and uncomfortable and just so intimidating. It's amazing. Easily one of my favorites again. So yeah, after Your Property, we move on to the title track of Cop. And this is a brilliant track exploring police brutality, and it features really horrible and nasty imagery throughout the whole thing. It's got this really slow motoric structure offset by these really loud tape loops that are so peculiar, man. They come in and it's just so ugh, it really puts me into a really uncomfortable state when listening to it, but I like it for that though at the same time in its very weird way. But again though, this one's so hypnotic and it's so nasty in its lyrics though. It's there's such brutality from the police force, such lines as "Nothing beats them like a cop, nothing hurts them like a cop, nobody rapes them like a cop, nobody burns him like a cop." And man, that is such uncomfortable imagery, It places us right at the center of this truly abhorrent and disgusting treatment of somebody at the hands of the corrupt law enforcement officers, Police brutality, it's nasty, it's horrible, and I really, really like how Gira has expressed it in this track with such, just such stark bleakness and just openness about it. It's just so direct, I would say, in how it's presented, and as a result, it's one of the band's most uncomfortable tracks on this whole album. It's so nasty and uncompromising in its vision and setting, but man, it's something Swans do so well though, and it's so brilliant on this track, I would argue. And so we move on to the penultimate track. We're given the really peculiar track Butcher, which is a very unsettling existential dirge that features this wonderful slow ascension up the guitar that's really fuzzy and drony in the background of everything, whilst this very peculiar beat pushes along, but it's very staggered, it's kind of awkward about it, but that's what makes it interesting, I think. It's very engrossing and, another one of my favourites, I think, for that very reason, and there's something about the way the chorus of, "Don't be a whore now," it just sounds so brilliant with the way Gira just holds that note in his voice, a slight descent into those low, murky tones that the rest of the band are pushing out with the instrumentals. Brilliant stuff, Uncomfortable again in its lyrics and stuff, but very interesting. It's also bleak and uncomfortable. It's so brilliant. Yeah, with that though, we get onto the final track of Cop. It's another quintessential Swans dirge that slowly chugs along with, in a very peculiar fashion. And it's the brilliant Thug. It's barely held together though by the instrumentals that just crash and scream all over the place. And it's once again, unsurprisingly, very miserable and cynical, of course, from Gira. It showcases such a disdain of the whole world around you. And as well though, Gira's vocals are kind of peculiar on this one, they sort of moan out what feels like this, this stream of consciousness, regarding such apathy towards the human race, such misery and existentialism. And there's a really brutal edge to what closes off one of Swan's most unflinching, cynical and, almost degrading album experiences. By this point, you've listened to the whole of Cop, right? And by the time you get to Thug, you're feeling so miserable and battered, and everything's just looking and seeming so ugly and uncompromising all around you, and it's a perfect expression of this really absurdly cynical look at the world, which, like I said, it makes sense given Gira's experiences of New York at the time and stuff. It's a brilliant way to close off the album, but it's so bleak and uncomfortable, I've got to mention it. But yeah, with that then, that covers the entirety of Cop as it was originally released back in 1984. But generally speaking though, when it comes to this album though, you'll often find it packaged together with the Young God EP, which was a 1984 EP release that is perhaps amongst one of Swans' most brutal releases, I would argue. This edition, however, I mentioned this earlier, I've got this edition that's got, the Greed Holy Money album art on it. This was released by Some Bizarre, and it compiles Cop with Young God on the first disc, but then it also compiles it with the follow-up albums of Greed and Holy Money on the second disc as well, which I think it's a bit weird, but, it's an interesting consolidation of, the early Swans releases. It's got the years here, 1984 to 1956. But yeah, more often than not, though, you will find, Cop combined with Young God, as I mentioned. And it's interesting because, Young God is this really, nasty, unflinching, unsettling, EP experience. It's got some of their most brutal tracks on it, I would argue, in terms of, studio recordings, where we haven't even gone into the live stuff. We might do at some point, but there's some cool stuff to talk about there. But I find this one weird, though, because the Cop Young God thing, that's great. It's got all the tracks on there. It's a wonderful flow into it. But when you get to Greed and Holy Money, I'll go into this more in their respective videos, but it's done some unusual things, and I'm not too happy about that disc 2 basically on this compilation. It's we'll get into it another time. In any case, though, I did want to mention as well, though, I find it a bit disappointing as well on this that it doesn't have the original Cop artwork in any way, shape, or form. Not even in the picture. The only thing you've really got is this weird picture on the back that I actually can't make heads or tails of. I don't know what this is meant to be. But, like I said, it does consolidate, the early Swans era, post-Filth, pre-Children of God era kind of stuff. And that's kind of cool, I guess, in its own way, right? Yeah, I don't know. They could have done a bit better with this, Some Bizarre didn't do the best job on this, but whatever. So, yeah, with all that, though, to sum up Cop itself, though, by Swan, this is, from the looks of things, from discussions I've seen on forums and on Reddit and things like that, it's actually one of Swan's more divisive albums, and I can understand that, though. Cop is arguably kind of samey with each of its tracks. Each is just flowing from one to the next, and they all offer similar concepts in terms of its sounds and its tones and stuff. Most of the tracks are really slow, really sludgy, really lo-fi as well, and stuff. And it's interesting. It's interesting though, because in the last Swans video, I mentioned how with Filth, they did kind of change it up in a couple of the songs. I feel like tracks like this, it helps to break up the album. It's a bit more of an album experience, rather than just having every track have that same sort of,
See, I did say that.
But on Cop, though, it's mostly just this dark, slow, industrial sludge. And for some reason, despite what I said on the previous one about enjoying, the differences and stuff, and here with, every song really covering the same themes and stuff and being very cohesive in its very sludgy industrial tones, I think I prefer Cop, to be honest. I don't know why, but lyrically, and I would argue musically as well, it's so much bleaker and so much nastier than its predecessor. It only gives us this really slow motoric dirges, and they're so uncomfortable, they're so dark and nasty. And the structural pacing of each of the songs, they feel way more concise, in terms of their slow, battering onslaughts of pounding drums and murky low-end stuff. And that tone as well, on Westberg's guitar, it's such an anchor for so much of the album and so much of the music on Cop. It ties it all together with this really fuzzy, noisy, sound that's in the background of so many of the songs, and it's very consistent in that as well. And that's what I like about it, though. It's very consistent, they're all bleak, they're all slow in tempo, they're all industrial in terms of its sound and its style and stuff, and it's really angry and miserable, but that's what I like about it. I like the consistent quality of that, and even with that sort of lo-fi element to it and all, it's very peculiar and stuff, but I really like it. I think it's one of my favourite Swans albums to listen to, especially from the early years. I don't know why, I just enjoy it so much. It's so just just so dirgy, you know. And yeah, with that though, we've covered Swan's second album, Cop. There, you know, this, as you probably might have guessed, it does actually rank among one of my favourite albums by Swans, especially in that earlier years though. And I think, you know, fans of the band are going to be quite surprised by that. But you know what? Swans have so many different albums, so many different styles, so many different things. You know, like everyone's going to have very different opinions on it, and that's fine. You know. This just ticks a lot of the boxes for me though. It's miserable, dirgy, incredibly apathetic as well, and what the album is lyrically about and what it sounds like, you know. So yeah, brilliant stuff from me. But where will Swans go from here? Well, in my opinion, I think it's just going to get way more and more interesting, especially as we really delve deep into the albums they do. Like, you know, in the next episode, we're going to be looking at the album Greed, which introduces one of the most important key members of the band. Like, it's going to be fun to get into that. For now, though, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Be my father.